Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. All right. Well, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in this fine country of ours. We are back for a fourth session. Sarah and I will be leading today, providing some more expert insights on how to lead through crisis, and particularly this crisis. Before I get underway with what we are going to cover today, I just want to remind everybody that the chat is open, and we would love for you to just type in something real quickly about either why you're here or what you'd like to learn, because we really aim to be responsive in these sessions, and we will be continuing these sessions throughout our quarantine period. So we are very interested, as I say, in being responsive. So please do type into the chat. Now, I'm not going to go into a full-blown summarizing of what we've covered before. All of our sessions are recorded and you can get to them on our website. But just as a quick reminder, this probably doesn't even need reminding, but we are in what's known as a landscape scale crisis. This is a pandemic exceeds the level of crises that many of us have weathered in the past, at an organization level. This is affecting all of us, both personally and professionally. And we've also talked about the ways in which we as human beings are responding to that, and likened it to the 5 or 6 stages of grieving process, and needing to continue to be cognizant of that, which reminds us that we have to engage in extra amounts of self-care and compassion during this time. So that's been one of our themes, and we will come back to that today as well. So we have put forward several ideas of how to cope with this crisis, and I'd hold up my simple chart again, or list. Compassion, connection, and control are really 3 themes that we have been repeating and will build upon today. And today specifically, we're going to focus on aspects of connection and control. And that we're going to do through talking about ways to encourage emerging leaders and to help people engage in lateral leadership. I'll just note that I attended a webinar yesterday. I'm learning and absorbing all the time, and yesterday's webinar was focused on how disparities are becoming exacerbated during this coronavirus crisis. While in some ways the crisis brings us together, in other ways it amplifies some of our existing differences. And I think that as the speakers wrapped up and talked about ways in which we all need to stay connected, one of their calls to all of us is to lead from where we are. And I've really taken that to heart and want to emphasize that during our session with all of you today. So I think that's a good lead in to introduce my colleague Sarah, who's going to talk specifically about lateral leadership.
So I spoke over the last few weeks about mindset. The things that you can control were inside of a circle, and the things that you cannot control were inside of a square outside of that circle. It's a rectangle, but close enough. Then we added a layer in between those 2 things, which includes the things that you can influence. And despite not having full control over them, you can influence the outcome in some way, shape, or form. So I have spent a good deal of time in my work and our work at Day Health, training teams at organizations to maximize their ability to exert influence in situations where you have no formal authority. I mentioned this last week. And these are areas where leadership has to happen laterally or among your peers and others that you have no authority over. Maria, can you back it up to the previous slide? Yes, that one. Great. And so let me give you an example. Your success on a project at work often depends on a number of other people, either inside of your organization or outside, to get things done, often in a specific time frame. And sometimes, or actually, frankly, often, you don't have the authority to require that folks meet deadlines or do high quality work, or even do that work at all. And so how can you lead in this situation to make sure that that work gets done, because it matters for you and your work? The more official term for this type of leadership is called lateral leadership, as Rosemarie mentioned, or leadership without title or without position. And it's distinct from the other types of leadership that we have on this slide in a number of ways. But lateral leadership describes the art of efficiently influencing others around you without having that formal authority, which you have when you're leading those who report to you. So that leading down that we have on this slide. Leading peers is essential for succeeding in the implicit leadership position that many people find themselves in. Particularly, you'll see this in a matrixed environment at work, or as I mentioned in the example I just gave, in an organization that requires you to collaborate with multiple people or teams to get your job done or do something that's bigger than yourself. And so sometimes we refer to this as leading from where you are, which Rosemarie also mentioned. And keep in mind that all types of leadership are critical. Strong self-leadership, you'll see on this map here, is almost a prerequisite to do lateral leadership well. Holding yourself to a high standard provides an example that will benefit you when you try to bring others along with you. And I'll describe that on the next slide. You can go to the next one, Maria. Thank you. So on this slide, I have 5 best practices that can offer sort of a quick and dirty starting point for you to begin thinking about how to lead through influence. And none of these should be super surprising, but when you put them all together, they're actually really powerful. So the first is to provide clear objectives. Not many people are inspired by amorphous goals. So being very clear about the why of what you're trying to accomplish to get your peers or other stakeholders on the same page and motivated toward the same purpose is really important. And make sure that you keep your messages consistent over time. A moving target is the same thing as an unclear purpose. And pro tip, be transparent. If there's something that's in this for you, you need to be clear about that. Don't let folks find out later. Be upfront about any conflict of interest or personal motivation. If you're honest about this, people will just trust your intentions more later. So the second concept is to keep your word. If you do what you say you're going to do, you'll build lasting credibility, which lends itself to peers and others following your lead more readily in the future. So basically think about it as laying the foundation for future collaboration now. Think of the first couple of times that you work with someone as putting money in your credibility bank. And then in addition, be frank about any limitations on your end. Is there a chance you might not be able to follow through on your end? What are your barriers? If you're clear about that from the beginning, then you won't lose face when those roadblocks actually become a reality, and they often do. So just being upfront about that is really helpful. Moving on, the third concept probably seems like a no-brainer, understanding others. We've been talking a lot about empathy over the last couple of weeks, and we're just going to keep hammering on it. It's very important. So similar to what I just said about being upfront and clear with those that you're trying to lead about your own limitations and your own motivations, it's also very important to understand others' needs, understand their motivations, understand their constraints. If you're asking for something that you know is a heavy lift and you don't have the authority to require it, you're more likely to get someone to do something if you create a mutually beneficial arrangement, where they also feel like they've won. Is there something that you can do in return? Is there something that they care about that they can gain from helping on this project? Perhaps they want to make sure they get credit for their work, or they'd like for you to help them with something that they are working on. If you take the time to listen well, or just directly ask about it, you'll develop the type of empathy that's critical for influence and trust later. And so some of the same words are coming back. The fourth area is to develop a partnership mindset. So treating others as partners and allies and not as subordinates is very critical here for lateral leadership to work well. If you're doing the 3 things that we already discussed on this page, this should already be happening. Having a partnership mindset is easy if everyone on the team is clear on the goal of the work, if you're pulling your own weight, and if the other team members trust you to consider their point of view. So just make sure that you're intentionally integrating your peers' needs with yours. So, teamwork, make it feel like a team. It's very important. The final tip here on this slide is to develop your network. So keep in mind that every single connection you've ever made in your organizational or personal life is important. If you associate with and build positive connections with as many people as possible, then your goal of, of having a pool of people to go to for expertise is much larger. So yes, this means that you should intentionally connect with influential people inside and outside of your organization, but be careful to remember that the people that you might not think are influential could eventually be very influential. And if you take the time to build good connections and rapport with those people ahead of that time, they'll actually trust your intentions more later when you approach them after the fact. So think of your friends from college. You probably met each other before anyone did anything big. And if you were friends before, then they're much more likely to trust you and your intentions when you approach them later once they are, in a position of power or influence or authority, or even if not. So I just said a lot. I typically like to solidify things when we do trainings by asking participants to go through an exercise to make things real for them. We don't have the time here to do that, but I do encourage everyone listening to take 5 minutes sometime today and just write down a situation that you've been in that required you to lead your peers or required you to gather a team that you didn't have authority over. And then take a look again at this slide in particular and write down one thing from each of these 5 areas that you would do differently to better influence others in that situation and get a better outcome. So with that, we're going to move on. As promised, Rosemarie is going to talk with us about how to elevate leaders in crisis situations. So we can move on to the next slide.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And if you have questions for Sarah, again, I encourage you to type things into the chat. So I'm going to build on what Sarah just shared and bring us back actually to a reference that came from an article that was researched by the McKinsey folks and calls a lot of great lessons out of the study of crisis management and leadership. So we have talked about in our previous sessions the demonstrating empathy, communicating effectively, and organizing a network of teams. Today, I'll hone in on elevating leaders, and a lot of this comes from my experience in leading through crises as well. So I'm going to remind us again, we're in this landscape scale crisis. It is of such a great magnitude that a lot of things that you may rely on in your organizational structure are not going to serve you as well. And I've come from a background of working in extremely large organizations with very solidified hierarchies. And there was always a protocol, a chain of command, if you will, and people were really not encouraged to step outside of the box that they had been placed into. And in a crisis, that does not necessarily work well because all of those defined boxes don't necessarily pertain to the crisis that's at hand. And so we talked about last week how you need to create some teams specifically to address what's going on with the crisis and how to lead out of the crisis. Because of this tremendous level of uncertainty, there is no one person with the crystal ball, and you need to rely on some people in your organization and help who may have an understanding or data or a level of character, if you will, that lends itself to responding to some things or projecting a path forward through this crisis. And I'm a big fan of bringing teams together and having a lot of mutual brainstorming because, again, there's no one person with answers. But I think, again, kind of breaking out of hierarchy and finding people and elevating them is really key. So who are those people? I'm going to answer that in a second. First, I'm going to just emphasize that doing this and being comfortable in looking for the folks and then truly empowering them does require some humility. No matter where you are in the managerial structure, if you're the CEO or you're just managing a team, sometimes that can go to your head and you can feel like, okay, I am supposed to know the answers. And again, in this kind of situation, you simply can't. So you have to kind of accept that on some level and then look for the folks who can really step up. Again, who are those people? It's somewhat based on experience. It is helpful if folks don't have a learning curve. But again, when we're in some unknowns, as we're talking about pivoting to a much more virtual world, engaging far more in telehealth than people had even conceived of, a few weeks ago, things like that may mean that there are people in your organization who are lower down in the hierarchy, and yet have more of that actual expertise. And so finding the folks who can contribute to the discussion with emerging expertise is really important. There's also a real necessity to find people who have the right kind of character. And there are a couple of aspects to that. I've been using my mug as a reminder to keep calm and carry on. But what you really need are folks who can, understand, of course, the gravity of what's going on, taking it in all seriousness, but not running around in a complete panic like a chicken with their head cut off. And that does not help any sort of situation. So being able to keep kind of this notion of deliberate calm is one key character aspect that helps in situations like this. And the next one is something that you as the leader, I think, need to exhibit, which is some level of optimism, but not a Pollyanna-ish optimism. And that's kind of been framed as bounded optimism. So confidence that we can get through this and we will lead through this is needed to convey to your teams, but at the same time, you don't want to set unrealistic expectations, because that goes back to some of the very things that Sarah was talking about. When those expectations are wildly unrealistic, you will break trust, because when those things don't come to pass, then people aren't going to believe you the next time you talk about it. So people would prefer to hear something closer to the truth. And even if that truth is you don't know all the answers, it's important to be that kind of communicator and that level of transparent, as we've talked about in some of the previous sessions. So you need to have bounded optimism. And in terms of the character of folks you're looking at for these teams, it's ideally folks who can communicate in that way. Some leaders have probably already emerged in your organization, but you always need to be on the lookout for more people, because there are going to be more stages of this as we get further into our response and management of the crisis, and hopefully into resolution. We will have different needs at different times. And so there's some fluidity to it, and how you form the teams and who you elevate as leaders. But what this has the potential to do is really make your organization stronger for the long haul, because you will be doing some of the very things that in calmer times we might say are nice to have. And now in this crisis mode, you have a chance to really help some people to step up and accomplish things. And I think that is incredibly empowering, and it's a way to just break out of hierarchical thinking and into something that really will serve your organization well on this path forward into what will be our new normal. I'm going to just note that there's another resource that we came upon just recently. It was published in Harvard Business Review, but a lot of the things I'm talking about have actually just been summed up again, but with a gender lens. And this article is called 7 Leadership Lessons That Men Can Learn from Women. And I came upon this through reading a bunch of Twitter things last night, and this one got flagged for me by somebody that I follow, and I read it and I said, wow, I was actually going to talk about these themes today. So I think it's fascinating that this is really something that men should be encouraged to learn from women. But the very things I've just talked about, the focusing on elevating others, being humble enough to do that, and don't command, empathize instead. Those are some of the lessons in the article. Maria is going to share the link with you, but I think that this is also something to keep in mind about what, as we move forward, as organizations and even as a country, what kind of leadership is really going to serve us well and keep us well. So I'm going to leave you with that thought. I'm going to come back because I've been focused a lot on what we need to do professionally. It also, a lot of these same lessons apply at the personal or home level. And I'll just give one example in terms of looking for folks that you can elevate. So within our family, my youngest daughter has an interest in cooking and baking and doing all things. And typically during our regular life, that's something that the parents or the adults are taking charge of in our house. And frankly, with everything being upended, the fact that she has indicated interest in stepping up and doing more has opened up just a wonderful opportunity to give this teenager some real opportunities to lead in our house. And so we can also give her, I think, kind of a whole new area that she can build some skills and confidence in that in our normal lives, maybe there wouldn't have been as much time for. But, we're looking for things beyond academics and, again, with everything being upended and kind of unsettled, it's nice if you can find ways to bring people into a leadership role, even if that's within your family structure and it wasn't the way you did things before. So I like when we can find parallels across both our personal and professional lives. So with that, I'm going to move to the next slide. Because Sarah referenced all the different kinds of leadership, and self-leadership is one component of overall leadership. She focused on lateral, but coming over to the notion of self, we all have to be engaged in self-care. And I like comforting visuals, and this is one that I came across in the past week or so, which is just a reminder to check your battery. For many of us who are very hard charging types, it feels odd to not have maybe that same energy level that you're used to having when you get up in the morning. And so it's really good for all of us to check ourselves and to check our team members to just say, how are you doing? If you're feeling great, that's wonderful, and maybe you are in a position to help somebody else today, and you can go with that. But if you're just feeling okay, then you should have a license to take that break in the middle of the day. Do the things that find something that you love that could make you feel better to help recharge that battery. I'm used to being able to go and go and go without having to take those kind of breaks, and I'm finding that harder to do during this pandemic, I'll be honest. So I think it's good to keep this in mind, that it's okay to do the self-care and maybe more frequently than you were used to doing. If you're all the way to empty, then you've really got to find how to get beyond that through potentially therapy, through other ways to build your strength back up. And we've talked about, again, setting boundaries around identifying what you can control and what you can't control in this crisis, and trying to find and build some comfort around the things you can control to build your own battery back up. So those are just a few thoughts about self-care. I will go, I wanted to stop and see if people have any questions or if anything's come through. Maria, did we have any?
One question is, what is the best way you've found to nurture connections and relationships over time in a genuine way? And I think, Sarah, this question came in when you were speaking about connections and relationships during your lateral leadership piece.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because while you're being intentional about it, it can feel transactional, and you don't want that to be the case. If you're trying to build your network, you want it to feel genuine. And And for some folks, this is easier than others. For, you know, some people really thrive on and do gain energy from making connections and from finding, you know, an interesting fact about every person that they meet or something. But if you exercise that muscle, it does become more genuine. I've coached folks on how to do this and how to make it more genuine and increase your emotional intelligence, essentially. But one thing that I found helpful is to, you know, genuinely be interested in finding out one unique thing about a person or one motivation about a person that you're interacting with. And if you have that in goal, almost like check the box, if you're a check the box person, yes, you check your box, but it also increases the amount that you know about that person. And as you build that muscle and exercise it, it'll become more genuine over time.
And I would add to that given this sort of unprecedented time that we're in, it is really great to just do a simple opening reconnect with somebody and say, how are you? How are you doing? I'm reconnecting with some professional colleagues with whom we've all been too busy. We don't have an in-depth phone conversation. We're just moving through our days or airports or wherever we are, and you're doing things on the fly, quick emails, that sort of thing. And now I'm finding that people are welcoming the chance to just really say, so how are you? How are you managing during this? What's going on in your family life? And then how are you navigating the new normal in your work life? And you know, that has just been an amazing way to feel connected with folks in this strange time and reconnect with people. And I think we showed a quote from Maya Angelou as a moment of inspiration last time, that you will not remember exactly what people say, but you'll always remember how they make you feel. And I think that that feeling part is so important right now, and checking in and seeing how people are doing. It's simple and it's really powerful.
Yep.
So I think if you have any further questions, please do send them because we'll be gearing up for next week's session. But to close, I chose for this week one of my favorite quotes that came through at the end of, that I first came upon at the end of a writers conference I attended a couple of years ago as I was embarking on the daunting task of writing a book. And the head of the conference encouraged us all to go forth and reminded us that life begins at the end of your comfort zone. I think this pandemic is stretching all of us way beyond our comfort zones, and that can feel discouraging at many times. But I think to keep in mind that there are real positives that will come out of this, that we will be stronger, and the very thought that life actually begins when we stretch ourselves like this is something we want to leave you with. So please do join us again next week. We will be back, and you can contact us by email at any point in the interim. Thank you so much for attending, and stay well, stay strong, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.